Thanks, Mark, for taking the time to do this. I appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure, Sammy. Thanks for having me. I appreciate the support. We're excited.
Yo, welcome to My Summer Lair. I'm your host, Sammy, currently in detention at Ridgemont High for 48 hours, Younan. And welcome Mark Altman to the program. You may know him from his work on hit TV shows like Castle and The Librarians, or perhaps you've read some of his comic book adaptations for Star Trek, or those oral history books on Battlestar Galactica and Buffy. He's an accomplished writer, producer, and deep diver of all things geeky. His latest project as a writer and TV producer is Greatest Geek Year Ever, 1982, which you can stream on the CW app. At the Movies 1982 is a year of cosmic wonders and electric dreams. E.T., the Extraterrestrial, Blade Runner, Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, Poltergeist, Tron, Conan the Barbarian, The Thing, Rocky III, so much more. Eddie Murphy's film debut in 48 hours. That list is not even exhaustive. 1982 was magic. So to navigate all of that awesome is the CW's Greatest Geek Year Ever, 1982, which uncovers the secrets, stories, and epic moments that shaped our geeky lives. Probably still shape our geeky lives. This isn't using nostalgia as a time machine. Greatest Geek Year Ever is a recognition of how our geek history still impacts our present and the unique, charmingly demented individuals we've all grown up to become. As you'll hear, what's super fun about Mark's work is that he's not afraid to get his hands all nerdy. He's like a pop culture archaeologist, digging up hidden gems and bringing them back to life for a whole new generation of fans. This My Summer Lair conversation is sparked by his experiences co-creating Greatest Geek Year Ever, as well as some delightful 80s related tangents, including one about Knight Rider. Oh, you can hear the Knight Rider theme song in your head right now, can't you? If you're passionate about all things 80s and beyond, if you're a fan of pop culture and the impact it has on our present era, or if you just enjoy two geeks getting all geeky in public, talking about the Greatest Geek Year Ever, this episode is dedicated to you. This time-traveling podcast extravaganza begins with my 1982 shameful confession.
Sound, the final frontier. My Summer Lair is an enterprise, a pop culture voyage with a continuing mission to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new creators and celebrate established producers, to boldly go where no podcast has gone before. And now here is your host, Sammy Younan.
If you're ready to go, we'll just kind of jump in and talk about all the fun that was 1982.
Yeah, whenever you're good to go. I'm ready. Sure.
Actually, I was debating if I should open with a confession because I was watching your docuseries and I've never seen Megaforce. Is it too late? Is it too late to go back and watch it? Have I missed the moment?
Sammy, it's never too late. What they say on 30 Rock, it's never too late for now. Mm-hmm. It's never too late for Megaforce. Okay. Because the thing is, it never gets better. It's always, it truly is in that rarefied air of Plan 9 from Outer Space and the Apple and, all these classic, terrible movies that are somehow wildly enjoyable. Mm-hmm. And, I don't mind criticizing it because no one is funnier and more self-deprecating about it than Barry Bostwick.
Yeah, he was great in your docuseries.
It really is such an artifact of the age. And it is kind of instructional because, that was a movie that was kind of made, obviously the director was a famous stuntman, but also it was sort of made at the behest of a toy company. They created, Mattel did the toys and the costumes and, all before IP Mania. This was the equivalent of the kinds of movies. This is what you get when there's no one with a real vision. I mean, you could say Al Ruddy, the producer of The Godfather, co-wrote and produced it, but this is not The Godfather.
No, it didn't even look close to The Godfather. But I was like, Watching the clips, I was like,
Yeah.
man, I want to check this out. I never got around to it. I'm kind of fired for that.
And I have to admit, I'll be honest, I'll make an admission to you now that I did not see Megaforce back in the 80s. It was many years later. So, that famous opening weekend when Blade Runner and the Thing opened and Megaforce, I did not see Megaforce then. I did not see it when it came out on VHS. I did not have the video game that Bryan Cranston did the commercial for as a young boy. So it was only many years later that I discovered the joys of Megaforce. And I was so glad to be able to include in the movie because, again, Boswick is so fantastic in the series talking about Megaforce.
Yeah.
And it kind of is sort of like, after you have your steak and your serious appetizer, and it's the dessert. You got your appetizer, which is the Thing, and then you get the sweet dessert, which is Megaforce. So I particularly love that episode where we deal with the three of them.
This is a bit of a tangent. It's not related per se to your docuseries, but what was the deal with all the cars back in the 80s? Like the General Lee, the DeLorean, the A-Team van, Knight Rider, Megaforce. What was the fascination with souped up vehicles?
That's a good question. I mean, the General Lee, dates back to the 70s, but, it's a good question because some of these are such iconic cars. I mean, like Knight Rider, we originally wanted to include all the TV series of 82 also, and we just realized we couldn't, or this would have been a 40-part series, right? Yeah. And Knight Rider was one of the shows that debuted in 1982. And, it's funny because I have, very good friends that actually have replicas of that car, who have the Knight Rider, who have the William Daniels answers voice in the car. And, God knows what they spent for it. And one of my friends is an Emmy winner. And, I don't know if I won an Emmy, if I would go and celebrate by buying myself a Knight Rider car, but apparently he did. And you're right.
Fight crime that way, though.
Also part of it. Yeah, totally. I also think it's the way we collected toys, because I think now people collect action figures and they primarily play, photorealistic video games. Back then, we had corgis and we had Matchbox. And so you would play with the A-Team van, or you would play with the Knight Rider car, or you would play with a lot of these, the James Bond vehicles, all through the obviously 70s and 80s and 60s. There were amazing James Bond cars, starting with the Aston Martin, of course. But, in the 70s, you had the submarine car in Spy Who Loved Me. And in the 80s, you had the new version of the Aston Martin, Living Daylights. And, 83 was the Battle of the Bonds. Octopussy had that, when Vijay Amritraj says, oh, there's a company car, and he has the little car, and it suddenly starts going in India and starts to go wildly, speed through the streets of, so it's, I think that's part of it, but I also think they were just really cool, and they usually did cool things. Again, it's not the 80s, but like the submarine car in Spy Who Loved Me. I mean, how cool is it that a car that can go underwater and work like a submarine and then come back on dry land? I mean, it's remarkable. It's super fun. Yeah. And I think that's why we were, obsessed by cars, And then Christine, obviously. It's funny because that was, Carpenter had wanted to do, after the Thing, Christine and Firestarter at Universal, but because the Thing was such a bomb, it ended up, not happening there. I mean, he ended up having to go to another studio because after the Thing, it sort of killed his chances. And I mean, that was the thing that was, so mortifying. At the time, he was married to Adrienne Barbeau. He comes back from a vacation, a week or two before the Thing opens, and he sees E.T. on the cover of Rolling Stone, friendly alien, and he realizes, oh my God, the Thing's going to bomb. And it was, it was mortifying to him. And he was right, obviously, that we love the Thing now, and it's a brilliant movie, but it made 12 cents at the box office back in 82.
Which is funny, too, because another one that's in the docuseries is Blade Runner, and that struggled to find an audience as well. It's weird. Yeah, I mean, these beloved movies now are like, audiences like, I don't know what to do with this. This is weird.
There's an old expression about, films and TV being ahead of their time. And that kind of is the thing that directors or studios use as an excuse to explain why something doesn't work, right? That movie didn't, it didn't work because it was ahead of its time. But Blade Runner truly was ahead of its time.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so interesting because even now, and I think we deal with this in the series, there's still a debate going on. Was the original theatrical version with the Harrison Ford narration, good, or is the definitive version the final version? We're without the narration, which was re-edited many years later and re-released. And you can hear, among even the filmmakers and the actors and obviously fans, there's no consensus.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Michael Dealey, the producer, says there's a consensus. Because Ridley says the final version where Harrison is a replicant and there's is the definitive version. But I think what we made very clear is there is no consensus. There's a very strong difference of opinion among people about what is the definitive version or the best version of Blade Runner. But clearly that was a movie that was ahead of its time, like 2001, because it continues to, there's probably no movie that is more influential than maybe Alien.
Right.
That Blade Runner continues to influence the state of science fiction, 40 plus years later.
Yeah, this is one of the things watching your docuseries that I kind of missed from like the way we have now with Netflix and everything is like the element of surprise. Because a lot of this IP was brand new. So I can get sort of why the audience may not know what a Blade Runner is. And when I watched like The Thing, I didn't know what a John Carpenter was at that point. Right. So, and at least with Blade Runner,
right.
I knew Harrison Ford was the dude from Star Wars. So I had some reference. But for the most part, it's all like an element of surprise. You don't really know what any of these movies are or they're going to be.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. I mean, the thing is, what was wonderful about that era and about the movie, maybe we saw an ad in the newspaper, maybe, Star Trek 2, you knew it was a sequel to Star Trek 1, but you didn't really know much.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a magic to that. There were no spoilers. There were you rarely, in most cases, if you hadn't seen the trailer in a theater, you hadn't seen the trailer because there's no internet, there's no way to see this stuff. So you go kind of in unspoiled, and that made it rather magical, and it was hard to see a movie. You couldn't reserve seats. So you'd wait online. And if it was a popular movie, often maybe you couldn't get into the 2:00 show. So you've been waiting around 2 hours for the next show. And what do you have to do? You talk to the people who are standing in line with you about what you've seen recently, what you're seeing. And so there was a much more profound sense of discussion about movies and their part. They weren't as disposable. Nobody called movies content back in 82.
Yeah.
It's in the best cases, they were art. But if not, they were entertainment. But they weren't content.
But it's also community, because there is a very subtle like love letter, I guess, to going to the cinema that runs through Greatest Geek Year Ever. And I know you worked in a video rental store for a bit too, right? Which is where we discovered some of these movies because we weren't old enough to get into them or couldn't like get to them or whatever.
Wow, you did your homework, Sammy.
Oh yeah,
you did your homework. That is true. I worked at a Leo's video bin in Brooklyn, New York when I was in high school. So probably in 82, I was already working in a video store. And that was such a novel job that will never really exist again. And that was where that was a big part of, again, the pre-internet discussion, because people come into the store and they say, oh, do you have the Road Warrior in? And you'd be like, oh, no, I'm sorry, Ralph, because maybe the guy only ordered 2 or 3 copies, the owner, because he didn't realize it was like a great movie. And then they say, well, what else is good? And you'd start to, you'd be like an encyclopedia, and this is you'd be a walking IMDb and say, well, maybe you want to look at this, or maybe, try Conan the Barbarian, or, if you like sort of cheesy Sword of Sorcery, maybe Sword of the Sorcerer you might enjoy, or, open to trying a horror movie, or if you want to share something to watch with the kids, maybe Dark Crystal, it was so wonderful because and then you get into conversations with the people who came into the store. And it's funny because even then you'd have the owner saying, well, whatever we have 12 copies of, that's what you should push. And I always push back on that because I could not recommend I did not want to recommend a bad movie.
Mhm.
I remember many years later, we had I was working in college at a video store, and we had hundreds of copies of Superman 4, The Quest for Peace.
You're
And he
right.
says, we can't give these away. You got to tell people it's good so they'll rent it. I'm like, I'm not telling people.
Yeah.
They trust me.
Yeah.
Not that Superman 4, The Quest for Peace is a good movie. I'm sorry, I won't do it.
This is an interesting element as well that runs through 1982, which is it kind of developed a lot of taste. Right? Now we know what kind of is good taste, what is quality. Yes, The Thing and Blade Runner bombed, but over time we've proven that these are good films, and if you're going to become interested in film, this is part of your homework. And so it's interesting how because of all this imagination created taste.
Well, look at that's a really good point. And look at the level of film discourse at the time. It was on a much more erudite scale. You had Pauline Kael and Jack Kroll and Vincent Canby, and obviously even Siskel and Ebert, on television, who were the nation's film critics for all intents and purposes. Mm-hmm. They talked about film with love and understanding, and an understanding of the past. And people went into movies not expecting to hate things.
Right.
So you would find what was good about it. You could see a movie that was inherently flawed and still, find what was good about it.
Like Megaforce.
Like something like Tron, like Megaforce. Yeah. But I mean, there are a lot of movies that came out, that aren't, perfect. And yet you would find the good in them. And if you talked about what didn't work, you talked about it on a much more critical level, maybe the writing, the cinematography, the directing, rather than just saying that was crap, because now people are competing to have the most clever, especially when you're trying to distill your thoughts down to 140 words or 140 characters. Mm-hmm. You're trying to find the pithiest and pissiest, most criticism of a movie.
Right.
But back then, when you were criticizing something, it was much more articulate. And I think, that's why even the films which necessarily aren't as good still resonate for us, because, I make the argument in the documentary that it's not necessarily the greatest movie going year at all time, but it is the greatest geek year. But other people like Scott Mantz, truly believe it is the greatest year for movies ever. But, that's why you could go to a movie that cost $1 million, like Sword and Sorcerer, compared to Conan's $40 million, and still really enjoy it. And in many cases, 4 decades later, still be talking about it. Lee Horsley's, 3-bladed, sword and things like that. And Richard Lynch is the evil villain. And, stuff like Beastmaster, which is $4 million, you still love, and you don't say, oh, it looks cheap and cheesy. You just remember that you love it. And, it was so funny at the time because HBO and would reinforce it because it would be on all the time. And everybody would call HBO, hey, Beastmaster's on station. Just like later on, they would say TBS, the Beastmaster station. And, their biggest movie was Gone with the Wind, followed by, the Beastmaster. And that was a $4 million movie. Mm-hmm. Now most TV is made for more than $4 million an episode.
Game of Thrones.
So it's, like Game of Thrones, right? Could you imagine if Game of Thrones looked like the Beastmaster? I don't think people would be having it.
Yeah.
I'd watch that.
Yeah. But you just used a key phrase that that enjoyment that people got out of these movies, because almost all the guests that you have in this docuseries, they're laughing and they're smiling and they're reminiscing and they're having a good time as they talk about the movies from 1982, whether they were in them or whether they went and saw them. And so can you just give us...
thank you for saying that.
Can you give us a little brief list of who's in it? Because these people are clearly having fun, and it was a good year for them, 1982.
Well, thank you for saying that, because I truly believe, I think why the TV show works so well and why people seem to love it so much is because of the mix of people who were there, people who made the movies, and people who loved the movies. Mm-hmm. So you go from, maybe for Blade Runner, a Sean Young and a Joanna Cassidy and the producer Michael Dealey and Paul Salmon, who wrote the book, to a bunch of, professional fans, because the fans in our documentary are all professionals who've gone on and been very successful doing other things. So you have somebody like screenwriter Zach Penn, who did Ready Player One, or Mark Guggenheim, who did Legends of Tomorrow, or Darren Scott, who produced A Menace to Society, or critics like Ray Drake or Sean Edwards or Scott Mantz. So it's such a great mix, because it's the people that made it who had one perspective, and then the people who were affected by it, who love it, or somebody like Felicia Day, or all these wonderful people. So, it's great. Like I look at in the second week, we deal with Star Trek 2. It's such a great combination because you got Bill Shatner and Nick Meyer, but then you have all these people who were impacted by the movie, talking about what it meant to them and why it was such a special experience. So I love that combination because a lot of times in these because we really truly, like the Ewoks, celebrate the love. This is all about a passion for the movie-going experience, for an era of movies that will never come again. And it really is a celebration. And particularly, we're in the middle of summer 2023. And to look back, 40 years earlier and look at this amazing group of films. And, they all spoke to different people because we haven't even touched on like the horror films. There's a whole generation that, came, of age watching those horror movies, whether it be on VHS or home video or, in the movies. And, it's such a great year because in the same way that, you look now at a lot of the movies that are being made by people who grew up loving comic books or the movies of the 80s. Back then, you had these filmmakers who grew up loving the movies of the 50s. So, or the comic books of the 50s. So you have Paul Schrader doing Cat People,
right.
Or John Carpenter doing The Thing, or, in George Romero's case, it's Stephen King doing Creepshow. This generation of filmmakers that grew up on movies in the 50s, paying homage to what they love. In the same way that filmmakers today are paying homage to the comic books and movies and TV that they grew up on. Because even something like Creepshow was based on the EC comic books of, the 50s that, George Romero and Stephen King loved so much.
Yeah, and one of the things that's interesting, too, is the credits for the end of the first episode. It says, in memory of Frederick S. Clark. Who was Frederick S. Clark, for people that don't know?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you noticed that because, obviously, not a lot of people watch the credits, but Fred Clark was the editor and publisher of Cinefantastique magazine. And Cinefantastique was like the New Yorker of sci-fi magazines. It started in the 70s and, Starlog was probably, the more populist one, but the more deeper dive, the one that took the genre seriously was Cinefantastique, and it covered all these movies, and it covered them all in a serious way. And said that in his mid 50s, about 20 years ago, but the legacy of Cinefantastique, which influenced so many of us, continues to live on, and that's why we felt it was worth dedicating this in the memory of Fred Clark, who was such a special guy, and, may not be a household word the way Stan Lee is, or, Forrest Ackerman, to geeks, but he belongs on the Mount Rushmore of science fiction magazine journalistic legends.
Yeah. This idea of like nerding out or geeking out, I want to like pick up on this one thread because in the Greatest Geek Year Ever, 1982, there's an interesting contradiction where some of these movies were blockbusters, literal blockbusters. People were lining up around the block to kind of get into them. But at the same time, nerds or geeks were also social outcasts. So it's an interesting contradiction because it's like everyone's watching them, everyone's digging them, but at the same time, people are having a hard time fitting in, if that makes sense.
I think it's very interesting because you're absolutely right. These were huge blockbusters, but I think that a testament to their entertainment, but why it resonated for so much more with geek culture, and we're geeks. It was not. Now everyone's a geek, right?
Right.
In 2023,
thanks to Marvel,
people use computers and cell phones, and thanks to Marvel, exactly. And everyone considers themselves a geek. Back then, it was a nerdy subculture. It wasn't necessarily cool to be a geek. So I think when geeks found each other, these movies were kind of like oasis that brought the geeks together. And again, part of that was standing online. And then, maybe the people you'd meet, you say, hey, let's go get a D&D campaign together, or let's go do this. And that's how you would meet people. It's kind of the equivalent of the internet now, meeting people, online. But there you were literally meeting people on a line. And that's how you would sometimes, make friends or find like-minded people, or find your tribe, so to speak. And these movies were sort of the magnet that brought these like-minded individuals together, because chances are, if you met somebody who was waiting 2 hours online for Star Trek 2, they probably liked Star Trek, right?
Yeah.
Or somebody who was waiting online 2 hours for Conan the Barbarian, chances are maybe they liked Robert E. Howard or Frank Frazetta, that you had something in common with them, and the same thing with the horror films and stuff. So it's really interesting. And then you do have these incredible mainstream movies that come out that year also that are remarkable. 48 Hours, Tootsie, which was one of the top movies of the year. I mean, one of the most successful movies of the year we don't really talk about that much in the documentary. It's Officer and Gentleman.
That's right, yeah.
But that is also part of this phenomena that's going on, which is suddenly the emergence of MTV in 83 in 81 becomes really significant in terms of marketing in 82, because all of a sudden a hit song on MTV can open a movie. So Officer and Gentleman, as great as that movie is, that movie opens because of the success of the Joe Cocker, Jennifer Warren song, which you couldn't avoid. Rocky 3 becomes a phenomenon, not because it's the third Rocky movie, but because of Eye of the Tiger, which is everywhere. You can't go anywhere without hearing Eye of the Tiger by Survivor. And it's a very different kind of Rocky movie.
Right. The first two Rockies were kind of a smaller, intimate movie, whereas this one is more of a kind of leaning towards a blockbuster kind of mentality.
Yeah, I absolutely. I love in the documentary when David Goodman points out that after these two serious, one of them an Oscar award-winning movie, suddenly this is the equivalent of a superhero movie, because basically Rocky teams up with his old nemesis. And of course, it has this huge song, Eye of the Tiger, which we all listen to, incessantly and never got bored of, unlike some other songs. And it was pretty remarkable. And I love that insight into Rocky 3, because people forget Rocky 3 was a phenomenon in a way that Rocky 1 and Rocky 2 weren't. Those are great, great movies. But Rocky 3 was like this incredible phenomenon. And it's suddenly this boxing movie, it wasn't Raging Bull, it appealed to kids. It was, something that everyone wanted to see. And, what a year for Sly. I mean, to have Rocky 3 and First Blood come out.
Yeah.
I mean, Rambo was born that year, became First Blood is a really good film directed by Ted Kotcheff. And Sly is great in it. And you have so many of these movies where you had actors who were doing multiple movies that year. I mean, you had Meryl Streep in Sophie's Choice and Still of the Night. Jessica Lange, who was in Tootsie and Francis. And of course, you had Clint Eastwood in Firefox, Honky Tonk Man.
Right.
So many of these films, people would be in not one, but two significant movies that year. And it's really, and of course, Shatner, most of all, in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, and Airplane 2, the sequel.
Which was
so
magic.
It's a great year for Bill.
Yeah.
Which is magic.
I like those airplane movies. So just to wrap up now, the Greatest Geek Year Ever, 1982, will be on the CW.
Yeah.
As the series rolls around, it's a docuseries. It's a 4-part docuseries. As each episode airs every Saturday. Are you expecting certain 80s movies to kind of suddenly start showing up on like the streaming like charts and stuff like this? Like all of a sudden there's like hunger now for Poltergeist or the thing?
Well, I'll tell you, I couldn't imagine a better home for this Greatest Geek Year Ever 1982, the CW. But CW has traditionally been a home for geek entertainment, with the Arrowverse and with all the amazing sci-fi and fantasy shows that they've done in the past decades. So it's such a great fit, and it's such a great schedule to have this on Saturday nights in July, because it brings back the feeling of being a kid, going to the movies. So my advice is to make some microwave popcorn, go get your good and plenties, plop yourself down in front of the TV every Saturday starting July 8th and watch these, because it's going to bring back so many memories. And I think you're going to learn a few cool things about, these movies you love. And you might even learn about some movies you never knew about, like Megaforce, right?
Megaforce,
Look at you. You're ready to go see Megaforce now.
We got to wrap this up so I can watch Megaforce.
That's right. And if people miss it, and if people aren't geeks and they're not home on a Saturday night, they can always watch it on the app, or the premiere is going to be repeated on Tuesday, the 11th. So plenty of opportunities to watch it and relive those memories that I think for kids, it's going to be really eye-opening. This is going to be like an alien world for them, that this is really the way people watch movies. This is really the way people celebrated movies. Oh my God, all those movies came out in 1982. How is that possible?
Right.
That's why I made it with Scott and Roger. And I'm so proud of it and so excited that, I get to share it with the world in July.
It's tons of fun. So it's the greatest geek year ever, 1982. Thank you so much, Mark, for hanging out and geeking out with me. Because
my pleasure, Sammy.
That was an
Just
awesome
remember
year.
one thing.
Mm-hmm.
Just remember one thing before you go.
What's that?
The good guys always win, even in the 80s.
There we go. See, this is a little lesson for the kids, a little takeaway for the kids. You're an inspiration. You and Megaforce. So thank you so much.
Well, take care, and thanks for the time. I appreciate it.
Yo, that was Mark Altman geeking out over Greatest Geek Year Ever, 1982 on the CW. And I'm Sammy Younan, host of My Summer Lair. Blessed are the geek, for they shall inherit the earth. The prophecy has come true since Star Wars opened in 1977. As you heard Mark, he makes the case 1982 was just a great geek year, not necessarily the greatest year in cinema. And I don't know. I believe you can make the case for greatest year in cinema. Now, I didn't go to the cinema for most of the 1982 movies. I was still little Sammy. Going to the movies was an experience, something I did only a couple of times a year. Watching this docuseries, I don't know how these classic movies came into my life. I don't know why or how I watched The Thing, but I'm glad I did. Even as a kid, The Thing made way more sense and appealed to my flourishing sci-fi taste than E.T. Poltergeist was super creepy and scary as a kid. The clown, the tree, the muddy swimming pool. Damn. Until you get older and realize for a horror movie, nobody died. Seriously? There's no body count for a horror movie that was made and broadcast in the era of the slasher? It wasn't until I got to high school that I found other people who watched Blade Runner and were willing to debate Harrison Ford's Pinocchio status. Mark briefly talked about working in a video rental store. As always, when we talk about these things, it's not that I'm glorifying the past or have some sort of desire to return to a more cumbersome time. Trust me, when it's the dead of winter in January and there is snow falling, Netflix is amazing. I'm thankful and I'm grateful. I'm not putting on pants and trudging to the video store. That being said, there is a significant loss we should acknowledge from when we transitioned from VHS rentals and even late night cable TV to streaming. Online, we pine for Blockbuster in a way we don't crave late night cable. Yet late night cable is where I discovered a number of classic 1982 movies. When you watch Greatest Geek Year Ever 1982 on the CW, you quickly realize the spectrum is what made the year so special. Our pop culture was so broad because we were just consuming all of this stuff. It was only later that we became selective or snobby and perhaps sophisticated, defending our taste with phrases like guilty pleasure. I like so much that we opened this conversation with Megaforce. That's right, out of all of those 1982 movies, we started with Megaforce. Initially and wonderfully, 1982 gifted us this broad foundation of fantastic images stitched together from flipping through late-night TV channels, taking risks at the video store when inevitably we discover a moment that would make us stop and ask, what is happening here? Who are these characters? There was no context for anything. That took a while to develop. Greatest Geek Year Ever 1982 successfully demonstrates back then, pop culture was a surprise party, and you were the guest of honor. This is a fantastic and fun docuseries from all kinds of recent Star Trek TV shows to the Marvel explosion. 1982 made a significant contribution as one of the key reasons of how our pop culture got here. My hope is Greatest Geek Year Ever 1982 is successful. The CW is so impressed, they greenlight Greatest Geek Year Ever 1984 as a follow-up. Man, if you think 82 was nuts, 84 was wild. For now, check out the docuseries on the CW, and today, right now, sign up for My Pal Sammy newsletter on Substack. Trends, not takes. With the My Pal Sammy newsletter, you'll savor insights into the cutting-edge world of popular culture. Discover new perspectives via the My Summer Lair podcast. Relish thought-provoking essays and fancy, remarkable photos. All of it will deepen your pop culture passions and help you impress your friends and even convert strangers into pals with your knowledge. MySummerLair.com/subscribe. MySummerLair.com/subscribe. Trust me, unlike your hair choices during picture day back at school in 1982, I promise you won't regret it. Thank you for listening to me in a Netflix world. 1982, yo.